Sensational news. Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack. Crimea has lost an important radar. He says that's it. Tatarstan is left without a storage facility for Iranian drones. Russia is halting gasoline exports. Up to 15% of oil refining has been destroyed. Strikes are happening all across Russia. Infrastructure is paralyzed. The Rashists, Muscovites, and Petersburgers are simply in a state of shock.
It's just a complete mess over there.
There were explosions. I just woke up from a sudden loud bang. We all jump up. I ask, what's going on? Dima says, Irina, they're bombing us. We just opened the balcony and look, it's right next to our building. The building is shaking. There's an oil refinery right next to the building. Oh my God, it's so terrifying.
Drones are turning the Druzhba oil pumping station in Bryansk into a blazing inferno. Oil refineries are burning in the Moscow region, Volgograd, Krasnodar Krai, Slavyansk, and Kuban. There are powerful explosions in Crimea, with more than 100 drones attacking the occupied peninsula.
Guys, it's a drone attack happening right now, everyone. We were just sitting here. Come on, let's go faster. And basically, it flew by. It flew right between us. Hurry, to the stairs. Shit, hurry. Another one, a second one, a second one, a second one.
There they jammed the connection and mobile internet. The most powerful Russian radar was destroyed there. Rock M is on fire. All.
Siren, that's it. Let's go. Let's go, run. Let's go, let's go.
Tatarstan is on fire. The martyrs kept there were destroyed. Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack. We will discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetan right now. Moscow and St. Petersburg are under attack. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health. Marina
Grigorievna, indeed, we are now starting to strike very intensively. We have destroyed or severely damaged the helium plant in Orenburg. This is the only facility in Russia that produces a critical component for missiles. How much could this impact the Russian missile program and their defense industry?
It will definitely reduce production, although they do have a sufficient number of laboratories where helium can be produced, including on an industrial scale. So now they can switch over if there is a certain critical shortage of helium specifically. But there's another point here. This plant processed 15 billion cubic meters of gas per year. That's the main thing. So the attempt to shut down the gas processing plant, if it succeeds, and I think it will, if not the first time, then the second, will make it possible to expect that the Russians will at the very least have to cap their wells. Their gas wells, they simply won't have anywhere to put the gas. What does 15 billion cubic meters mean? Ukraine consumes 15 billion cubic meters for its own needs. That's as of now. We used to go up to 20 when we were at full capacity. Right now, we consume about 15 billion cubic meters. So that's the consumption of an entire country by a single plant. If you strike it, then at the very least, first of all, they don't get a certain amount of oil, gas, and so-called dollars. The currency from oil is the economy, a blow to the economy. Secondly, they have nowhere to put the gas, so they'll have to shut down the wells. And a shut-in well later on will take years to reopen, or they'll have to flare it. But if you flare for too long, let's say, it causes destruction as well. So this is a triple blow, I would even say, right away to the Russian economy, the military sector, and technological aspects, especially regarding the transfer and involvement of certain services in the storage of this gas. In other words, the right approach is when intelligence is at work. I always say, when intelligence chooses its own targets, no joke, no one else, they find such key points that, if destroyed, either halt the entire technological production cycle or deliver several blows at once in multiple directions like this Yelovy plant. And where is that exactly? All the way near Kazakhstan, not far from Akubinsk. Well, by those standards, at least they made it there.
Roman Nikolaevich, there's been an attack on the Druzhba oil pumping station, the largest oil pipeline hub near Bryansk. It's on fire. And can we say, as you always put it, that this marks the beginning of a systemic collapse of Russia's oil infrastructure? We're making a concerted effort to strike.
Well, now we can talk about it because over the past 2 weeks, there have been specifically systematic, and that's very important, systematic attacks. Systematic strikes are being carried out against Russian oil pumping, oil refining, and the oil and gas sector. The reason I emphasize the strike on what seemed to be a helium plant is that in reality, it's a strike on gas processing, 15 billion cubic meters. Plus, if we list the most recent strikes, for example, on oil refineries, Novokubishevsky, Ryazansky, Afipsky, Saratovsky, Uktinsky, and there were strikes on Wednesday, there were strikes on the Novoshaktinsky and Volgograd oil refineries. So this is definitely systematic now, plus the strike on Uneka. Remember how many years we've talked about Uneka with you. Uneka is a 40-kilometer oil pumping station on the Druzhba pipeline. It's called the Druzhba pipeline. Yes, that's in the Bryansk region. Moreover, the oil that is pumped by Tatarstan, most of the oil in the Druzhba pipeline is Tatar oil. About 300,000 barrels of oil pass through Uneka every day. That's $18 million a day that the Russian economy receives from selling this oil. After Uneka, the oil continues on its way. There it goes through Mamai. Mamai is nearby, which is also another pumping station. Then the oil splits off, meaning the pipeline branches toward Usluga near St. Petersburg, where Russian tankers, the so-called shadow fleet, are loaded. Part of the pipeline goes to Belarus, branching off again to the Naftan refinery, the Belarusian oil refinery, and to the Mozyr refinery. From Mozyr, the pipeline branches off again, heading toward Poland and Germany. All of this oil, everything that passes through Uneka is what was hit today. And part of the pipeline that, together with the already refined oil in the form of diesel, two pipelines run. One is a diesel product pipeline, and the other is the Druzhba oil pipeline passing through Ukraine, which we pump to Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. But the Czechs have already refused oil. They switched to Russian and Italian oil, abandoning the pipeline. In other words, there is a move away from Russian oil. Nevertheless, a strike on Uneka would practically stop this entire cluster if Uneka is taken out. The first time we targeted it in this round, it was unsuccessful, as I understand it, because there was no confirmation of a fire or anything else, although the technological cycle for oil chemical analysis was halted. Today's strike, or yesterday's, you could say that this strike already has inflicted more or less some damage. Well, it's not far, 40 kilometers away. So basically, if we've started, believe me, it will burn. Uneka will burn, but in order to completely stop the oil flow, you need to destroy 3 consecutive oil pumping stations. So we need to work on Mamayev, basically starting with the Steel Horse. If you remember, we talked about it 6 months ago, the Steel Horse, that's over there in Zabryansky. Steel Horse, Desna, Uneka, and in the Mamayev area, all of that needs to be taken out. And then it will be possible to completely stop the oil flow through the Druzhba pipeline. I think that's exactly what will happen. In other words, we have the capability. The main thing is that our hands aren't tied by various mechanisms like they were at the beginning of the year. When we started, by the way, with that same Uneka, there were some good strikes on Uneka, the Steel Horse, Desna, and Uneka around February or March. But then in March, we were stopped.
Roman Igorovich, regarding the analysis of the strikes on the oil refineries in Volgograd, in Krasnodar Krai, in Slavyansk, in Kuban, simultaneous attacks across all these regions. Roman Igorovich, what does this indicate, and to what extent are we truly able to target the fuel market and military supplies in Russia? So how will these strikes specifically affect the fuel market and military supplies in Russia?
Well, I've already named them. All 7 of these Russian oil refineries process 1 million each. There are about 30 of these million-ton refineries in Russia, maybe just over 30, that's all, not that many. There are another 50 small ones, but those are minor, basically. They're more like moonshine stills. The real million-ton refineries, there are about 30 to 35 of them, and you could say we've already hit 7 of them. That's a quarter or a fifth, depending on which ones are operating and their production volume. We can stop, completely shut down all Russian oil refining. And if oil refining stops, oil production will stop too. Halting oil production will lead to these oil wells being shut in. There are thousands of them, but still there will be nowhere to send the oil. They'll have to shut them down. Reopening a shut-in well is sometimes a real gamble. So that everything settles down there, because there are certain factors related to water injection. These are technological cycles. Strikes on oil refining are very important for us. That is, shutting down the refineries first will hit the Russian economy and lead to the beginning of Russia's collapse. That's the only way to defeat Russia. And naturally, the fuel that was supposed to go to the Russian army simply won't get there, it won't be produced. Strikes on plants that produce aviation kerosene are especially important. But by the way, the first 2 plants, Novokubeshevsky and Ryazansky, they produce aviation kerosene, or rather they used to produce aviation kerosene, and the strikes were chosen correctly, meaning the targets were selected properly. The main thing going forward is not to stop, so that in the near future, all those people who are trying to tie the hands of our armed forces in dismantling the Russian Empire don't force us to stop striking oil refineries by pushing for some kind of air truce or something like that. If we keep working like this for 6 months, look, in just 2 weeks, 7 oil refineries have been hit. By the end of the year, the Russians won't have a single one left. We'll get to the Omsk refinery too. If we manage to reach the Orenburg refinery near Kazakhstan, believe me, we have plenty of acquaintances in Kazakhstan who will at least help us get to Omsk as well. The Omsk refinery is the largest. They process 21 million tons per year.
Roman Igorovich, the Russian government has banned the export of petroleum products because of Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries.
That's right. Again, it's a double blow. First of all, what did the ban on gasoline exports lead to? To a decrease in foreign currency earnings for the Russian economy. A blow? Of course it's a blow. It seems that only 2 plants were hit at that time, the Novokuybishevsk and Ryazan refineries, and they immediately made the decision because Novokuybishevsk processes 7 million tons per year and Ryazan processes about 15 to 17 million tons. So basically that's like one Omsk refinery, a large Russian plant. Naturally, this shortage was immediately felt. And moreover, why is the shortage being felt? Because a Russian mobilization began. An army on the move consumes a huge amount of fuel. Naturally, there isn't enough. Either the army won't have enough, or it's still harvest season, so for the harvest, or for civilians on a personal level. Naturally, they had to make the decision to restrict gasoline exports. Gasoline started to rise in price, at least on the markets, on the major markets, on the wholesale markets. And this is already an indicator that there is a real gasoline shortage. And it will definitely continue in the future. Moreover, it is precisely the gasoline shortage that could lead to serious stagnation in the Russian economy through inflation, because 50, sometimes 70%. In Russian goods, prices are essentially the cost of delivery, that is, the price of gasoline itself. Naturally, if gasoline starts getting more expensive, then consumer goods will also become more expensive for Russians. And Russians live by their TV and their refrigerator. But then, if this herd opens the refrigerator and finds nothing there, just a fig with poppy seeds, well, they'll lick the poppy seeds, obviously look at the fig, and then they'll start mooing. And not just mooing, they'll start looking for horns somewhere ready to butt heads. That's a big problem for Putin. By the way, that's what he fears most, when the Russian mooing, bleating herd starts looking for something to eat, because their salaries just aren't enough to fill the fridge. And you can't really feed yourself with television. You can only feed your brain, but your stomach has nothing to do with the TV.
Roman Grigorievich, last night more than 100 drones attacked occupied Crimea. There's information that the radar Scala M in Crimea was destroyed. This means the loss of the ability to control up to 350 kilometers of airspace. And what does this now mean for the defense of occupied Crimea and the use of Russian aviation? Roman Grigorievich.
Well, there's not just one radar there. These are the radars of the enemy's radio technical troops. About 3 to 5 of them are destroyed every week, that's for sure. So on one hand, there's a systematic clearing of Crimea going on, and on the other hand, the rather interesting action is being carried out. After we destroy the radars, the Russians take radars from their anti-aircraft missile systems, say from some oil refinery, and transfer them to Crimea. Crimea is their priority. Naturally, this means you don't have to run all over Russia destroying every air defense system. You can just focus on Crimea and they'll bring them there themselves, like in Chornobyivka. So it's like a big Chornobyivka. How many times was it? 30 strikes on new Russian troops and equipment in Chornobyivka. So these are the strikes. The same picture is happening here in Crimea. You can focus on destroying all of the enemy's air defenses through Crimea. They'll bring them there themselves. They'll leave their rear areas exposed, but they'll try to protect Crimea, the Kerch Bridge. So today's strike on Crimea, which we're talking about now, is exactly one of those attacks. Moreover, it was a large-scale attack. Not just the radar was hit. The strikes were mainly carried out on Feodosia, on the Kerch Bridge, and in the area around the Kerch Bridge, as well as on the Port Kavkaz, which is next to the Kerch Bridge, and is used, first of all, for pumping fuel into Crimea. There are pumps there. Naturally, there are also railroad ferries that go into Crimea. They are loaded on the Caucasus side, then travel by rail and are unloaded in the Kerch area. So this was a massive strike on Crimea. I think within a day, the General Staff will confirm it after decoding data from technical surveillance means, or at least the satellites will show where the strikes were delivered. But the strike was serious. It hit Feodosia, some military facilities, and the port of Kavkaz.
Roman Nikolaevich, today I saw a report related to occupied Crimea, and it said that the Gauleiters, the occupiers, the occupation authorities have announced that there will be no mobile connection or internet at all in the occupied territory of Crimea for a very long time. This was done so that they could fight against the drones of the Ukrainian armed forces. So now they've shut down mobile service and internet on the occupied peninsula. What does this indicate?
They're afraid that's what's happening right now. Why are they doing this? Well, from a military logic standpoint, that's exactly what it is. Why? Because there is a certain protocol for protecting high-risk facilities, as they call them, like the Kerch Bridge. In order to fully secure, let's say, from reconnaissance to targeting, all communications are shut down. Naturally, the highest security protocol for the Kerch Bridge has now been activated, and they're going to shut everything down. Everyone there will be marching in formation on the parade ground for these few days until Friday. And most likely, even after Friday, it will continue until Monday, because they won't be able to go on a bender starting Friday like Russians usually do. That's why I think they'll keep this maximum secrecy mode, at least in terms of security, and keep the Crimean bridge closed until Monday. We'll see. That's the question here. We don't always use Russian communications either. There are other mechanisms. Tamarin?
Gorky, the second Darsby, was buried, and another Shahed in Tatarstan. We literally did this again in just a few days. A repeated strike on a target 1,300 kilometers from Ukraine. At this point, how does this demonstrate the capabilities of long-range drones and their strategic effect?
Well, judging by the video, by the way, I should say, these are already new drones. These are drones like the Iranian Russian or the Iranian Shahed or the Chinese Sunflower 200. In other words, it's a wing-type drone. This means that we have already set up serial production, or at least on their own base, the SBU guys have established the production of pretty decent drones, all things considered. The thing is, it's precisely the wing configuration that allows, if there's enough fuel and a good engine, to push this drone several thousand kilometers. Everything depends on the reliability of the engine and the amount of fuel. So they've gone into this area and they're moving in the right direction, because fixed wing drones are of course better used at short ranges. At least that's how we use the Baba drones, or for example, the same Fierce and 196s. That is, fixed wing drones are actually very easy to shoot down after all. The speed is lower, but a winged drone can be accelerated to good speeds. And eventually you could even install not just an internal combustion engine there, you could put in a turbine without significantly changing the configuration itself of the aircraft. So in other words, they started thinking ahead about this. And basically, if the SBU got involved in this, believe me, they're doing a great job in this regard. Well, first of all, when it comes to target designation and carrying out combat missions, they've made significant progress. And also in the production of this type of drone. And as for the fact that the Geran drones are now Russian-Chinese, and because they're Russian-Chinese, they can produce a huge number of them. So what is a Geran? Right now, a Geran is a body cast in Russia. The body is Russian, but the engine is now supplied by the Chinese, who have set up a factory in Russia. The internal combustion engine is currently produced in Russia, while the turbines are still made by the Chinese for the Geran 3. Most of the components and assemblies, especially the servos and some control systems, are Chinese. Over 50% of the parts are Chinese. The main control board, however, is produced at Venieri Progress. So this is the Geran. And now they've started producing them in very large quantities. They produce 150 to 200 units per day. They use up to 100 against us, which means they store about 100 in their warehouses. The security service identified these warehouses and sent drones there. As for the extent of the damage, we'll see, but I think confirmation will come in some time. But we have to keep working, even if it's 1,500, 300,000 or 1,500 kilometers, whatever drones can reach. The main thing is to scale up production and keep hitting them constantly. Believe me, this issue can be solved, the numbers can be reduced, or rather in Iran and at the warehouses, and eventually to get to the production itself, because the production needs to be taken out, and not just in Russia. Because without destroying production in China, we won't reach a certain level. In the end, even if we destroy all production in Russia, they'll just move it to China and start bringing in Chinese drones.
Roman Lvovich, here's some fresh information to confirm your words. Bloomberg reports that the Saratov oil refinery has stopped receiving oil after the latest drone attack. This could affect gasoline supplies. The situation is dire. It belongs to Rosneft. Roman Igorovich, could you comment on this?
This Saratov plant on the banks of the Volga used to process 7 million tons of oil. So it's between The Volga divides, so it turns out Saratov and Yelts. On the west side is Saratov, on the left bank is Yelts to the east. And this plant was right on the bank of the Volga. Naturally, it was only a matter of time before we reached it. The main thing is they gave the order when they finally allowed us to strike, as they say. The question is, why was it forbidden in the first place? That's another question. That's Article 111 of the Criminal Code. And after they started striking, naturally, the Saratov oil refinery immediately came under attack, and it's not going anywhere. It's been standing there for 90 years. That plant is 90 years old. If I remember correctly, the plant is called Creaking. So it was only a matter of time before it would be hit. They hit it, completed the combat mission. The unmanned systems forces did their job. I think it was done by the AN-196s, those fierce Antonov drones, which delivered the strike. It came to a complete stop, meaning at least 7 million tons. Russians will now have to figure out what to do with it. And most likely, since they can't send any extra oil to foreign markets now, they'll start shutting things down. They'll start shutting down the extraction infrastructure, and there will be a shortage of gasoline. This plant mainly produced gasoline and diesel. And naturally, this gasoline and diesel won't reach either the domestic market or the foreign market because it's shut down. Not even the Russian army will get it. And besides, it didn't really supply Moscow that much anyway. In order to cut off, say, fuel supplies to Moscow and the Moscow region, you'd have to take out 2 more plants. Take out the supply chain. Who supplies there? Mainly, it's the Kapotnya oil refinery. It supplies almost half of the gasoline and diesel for Moscow and the Moscow region. And if we do manage to finish it off, if we finally take down the Druzhba oil pipeline and shut it down along its entire route, then the Mozir oil refinery, which supplied the other half of the fuel to Moscow, Belarus, the Mozir refinery would be out too. So Muscovites, besides not being able to fly out, now won't even be able to leave by other means. So just imagine spending the velvet season somewhere sitting in Moscow basements.
Roman Igorovich, a very important topic, is the enemy's offensive, the enemy's advance near Dobropolye, and the threat of encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. Let's start with Dobropolye, a breakthrough of 15 to 18 kilometers, the capture of Kucheryav Yar and Zolotoy Kolodets. At this point, is this a local tactical operation or the beginning of a major enemy offensive?
The thing is, when carrying out the objectives of the first wave, which are shaping operations, so-called reconnaissance by combat, attempts to break through the front lines, then the second wave moves in afterward. The second wave, which is now starting to arrive, we can already see it. Equipment, ammunition, personnel, so-called fresh troops, they can enter the breakthrough if it is achieved. And then they can move into open operational space. And as they say, it's a free-for-all. Go wherever you want, as far as you can until you run out of fuel. But right now, this breakthrough hasn't happened because everyone keeps saying breakthrough, breakthrough, but no, there is no operational breakthrough. What we have is operational infiltration through our positions. But why did this operational infiltration happen? Because we don't have enough troop density along the line of contact, especially on the main section from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. Well, it's not enough. Everyone understands that perfectly well. Roughly speaking, there should be 3 strong points per kilometer, meaning a company should cover 1 kilometer. But sometimes in our case, a company is covering several kilometers. And on some stretches of several kilometers, there's only 1 strong point. Naturally, between these platoon strong points, the Russians can slip through in sufficient numbers to then regroup somewhere in the rear and cause havoc at distances of 10 to 15 kilometers. So in this way, they broke through, but not in the usual sense of a breakthrough. No one saw them. They slipped through. They slipped through and then started causing chaos in the rear, as it's called. Deep State drew a map showing the breakthrough as such. There was no breakthrough, and at the moment, a decision has been made to transfer reserves there to plug the gaps in that direction. How long have we been talking about this? We've been talking about this for 3 months. A decision needs to be made. Syrskyi needed to make a decision, not to run around the Sumy, Kursk, Kharkiv, and Belgorod regions, but to focus on the Eastern Front. Why? Because the main objective for the Russians is to capture the Donetsk region. Naturally, they will put pressure on Mirnorod and Pokrovsk, because without Mirnorod and Pokrovsk, they won't be able to get to Dobropilya. And without Dobropilya, eventually they'll come from the west already toward Kursk. Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and Drushkivka. In other words, this operation is obvious. It's right there on the map. And our third line of defense was holding the Russians back quite well until Syrskyi started reducing the troop density. Why he started to reduce it, let them figure that out themselves. Whether politicians told him to or he came up with it himself, decided to drop out or just stupidly surrender Donbas. I don't know why. But based on the inaction, I'll repeat once again, if we hadn't been talking about this for 3 months, maybe it wouldn't be worth mentioning now, but for 3 months, almost every broadcast, we said that in order to hold the Eastern Front, we need to increase troop density and bring in the security forces. Every stream talked about this. So what happened? In the end, they did deploy the security forces and sent them there. The National Guard of Ukraine, the First Corps, the National Guard, that's exactly who the security forces are. The National Guard is part of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So the Ministry of Internal Affairs must act. There are 300, and we need 100 for the armed forces of Ukraine. That's it. No more questions or breakthroughs. Well, this isn't a breakthrough. Let me repeat. It's infiltration. Infiltration that our observation posts simply didn't notice. They just didn't see it. And then when they showed up in the rear, that's when they started dealing with these issues. It's pretty much the same situation, pretty much the same as, remember, when Lapti and Aladin once said they didn't notice the Ukrainian troops that got into their rear last year in Kursk. This was exactly the same kind of tactical infiltration. In other words, there were too few of Lapti and Aladin along the borderline. Our troops slipped through between them, and then they were simply crushed from the rear. They were pressed down, and a breakthrough began. So to prevent such a breakthrough, it's better not to allow it in the first place. That is, immediately increase the density of troops. On the Donetsk front, nowhere else will the Russians launch large-scale offensives. Nowhere except the Donetsk and part of the Zaporizhzhia front. Why do they need to expand the land corridor even further? Why is Putin now demanding that we withdraw ourselves from the Donetsk direction?
Roman Egorovich, you just spoke very concisely, but I would like you to specifically articulate separately for our audience, because this is very important for them, about the threat of encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. So, what is the danger for the armed forces of Ukraine in this sector?
If we allow the encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, in other words, if they push us out from this direction, then they will have what is called operational freedom of movement. Practically all the way to Pavlograd, which is already in the Dnipropetrovsk region. In reality, the operational space extends all the way to the Dnipro River. That's why, for example, when the Poles talk about to the Dnipro, they mean up to the Dnipro River, because they could advance not only toward Pavlograd or Dnipro, but also toward Kremenchuk or Poltava. From the left bank, basically anywhere they want. It's practically all flatland there. That is the third ridge, the last ridge, the so-called Donetsk ridge. This is the third line of defense, which our forces are currently holding in the area of Pokrovsk. From Pokrovsk to Kostiantynivka. If you let them through, then only the Dnipro River will be able to stop them further on. I mean, the Dnipro River. Do you know why the Poles are now building up their defense system and where? On the Vistula. Not along the border with, say, Belarus or the Kaliningrad region, because it's also flat terrain there. And the first real barrier is the Vistula. That's why they're building a certain system on the western bank of the Vistula. By the way, they're doing the right thing. This is the correct course of action. So we must not allow the Russians to break through the third line of defense. Otherwise, we'll have to catch them on the right bank of the Dnipro. They're already milling around on the left bank near Kherson. So this is a very dangerous situation at the moment. Then why have we been talking about it for 3 months? We're not just talking about it for no reason. Stop running around Sumy and Kursk. The Russians won't be able to come from Kursk to Sumy and Kyiv. Don't believe those crazy deputies who have worn their hands down to the elbows digging Kyiv's defense system. There's no need to dig trenches around Kyiv. They won't make it to Kyiv. Pull those deputies back. Let the Verkhovna Rada pass some laws instead. Otherwise, in their foolishness, they'll end up digging all the way to the center of the earth. They've started digging around Kyiv. And now, comrades in the military, well, not exactly military, you know what I mean. So there's no need to run anywhere. It's all just flashbangs, so-called diversionary maneuvers. By the way, it's the same story in Kharkiv and Kherson, an exact copy. But the real pressure from the Russians will be on breaking through the third line of defense, on capturing the Donetsk front lines. And that's where they're concentrating their forces. This is something Suske needs to be told, I don't know, 5 times over. What do you mean? Explain it to him. Do you think he doesn't understand? He's just as much a military man as I am. He understands this perfectly well. Any lieutenant understands this just by looking at the elevation map, seeing the positions of the forces and assets on both sides. You immediately know where one side will advance and what the other side needs to do. If Syrskyi understands this and still doesn't act, then it means he's simply not doing it. For some reason of his own, or perhaps because of political orders he receives from. So let them figure it out themselves, but we won't let you surrender Donbass, comrades from the Green Party.
Dear audience, please like this video and write a few kind words in the comments to support Ukraine and its armed forces. Roman Hryhorovich and I are working for you, for audiences all over the world, so that they know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. The well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Hryhorovich, thank you, and as always, see you this Friday.
Goodbye.